I think what we're talking about here are political risks, that is, actions or inactions of governments that have potentially negative consequences, like expropriation. I think that's the one that everybody thinks about. And there are various kinds of devices that one can use. First of all, there are different business strategies so the business strategies might be, for example, that in entering a particular country, you'd enter it slowly. You take step by step with small investments and then slowly building as you get confidence in the environment. So that's one way. So there's a basic. Secondly, there are contractual provisions which you can enter into in order to protect yourself against government action. You can, for example, make agreements with the government if you have a government contract that your contract should provide for arbitration, international arbitration, so you're not under the jurisdiction of the courts, of the local courts. I think what businessmen are concerned about is that if they are in local courts or if they have to deal with the government, that they will not be treated fairly and evenly, and that there will be bias on the part of the courts toward the government or toward a local partner. So arbitration is generally international. International arbitration is based on a tribunal, which consists usually of 3 persons, one appointed by each side, and then a third that is agreed upon by the parties, who is the president or the chairman of the tribunal. This tribunal functions outside of the territory of the country concerned, so it's more or less free of interference from the government. So that's one technique. What's had developed, I think, certainly in the last 50 years, another mechanism are treaties. Right now there are about 3,500 investment treaties in the world today, and they generally do 2 things. First of all, treaties are international agreements between states in which one state agrees to give a specific level of treatment. And that's the word that's often used in the treaty, a level of treatment to investors of the other country. That they will not expropriate the investor, that they will allow the investor to repatriate its profits, that they will be fair and unbiased in dealing with the investor. So that's the standard of treatment. But coupled with that is a way of trying to enforce those promises, and that is to say it provides for investor-state arbitration. What that means is that if an investor feels that he has been injured by the government, that the government has not kept its promises under the treaty, the investor can bring arbitration against the state internationally in an international arbitration tribunal. So this has given some enforcement mechanism to these treaty promises, and therefore the idea is that if a state realizes that it can be sued, and states are sued, and that it risks having to pay a substantial judgment, that will restrain the government from acting negatively against the investor and not living up to its commitments under the treaty. So that's basically what bilateral investment treaties do. We have multilateral treaties that do the same thing, where there are 3 countries, but usually within those treaties there are investment provisions. The whole idea is to encourage the movement of capital from one country to another on the belief that that will lead to prosperity for both countries concerned. I did do the research. I've done actually a couple of researches on that subject. First of all, I think you have to be a little cautious, because lots of factors besides the existence of a BIT or a BIT, bilateral investment treaty, influence the investment decision. The quality of the workforce, whether or not there's peace and tranquility in the country, whether or not it's a large market or a small market. All of those commercial and economic factors will influence the investment decision. But I also think there is evidence to say that the existence of a bilateral investment treaty, or indeed several bilateral investment treaties from a country, is a signal to the international capital markets that first of all, investment is welcome, and second of all, that investment that has entered the country will be treated fairly. So we look at the effectiveness of the treaty has been made effective. It's not just promises, because we can all make promises, but there has to be some enforcement mechanism, so that those promises are credible. And that's what arbitration is designed to do. The state is saying, look, we're not only promising you, but we are also committing ourselves to arbitrate in the event we have a dispute. And we're going to arbitrate not in our courts, not in your courts, but we're going to arbitrate in an independent tribunal and accept that tribunal's decision. And so what we're seeing in the world today is there are obviously investment conflicts. There are always conflicts in business. We're seeing that many of these conflicts are being resolved by investors. Investors don't always win by any means. But often when they do win, the awards they receive are substantial. So I think that is it's a kind of a warning to states, and states I think realize it now, that if they don't keep their promises under the treaty, then they risk having to defend themselves in arbitration, and if they are unsuccessful, then they will have to pay a significant damage award, and some of them run into the tens of millions and the hundreds of millions of dollars. Well, I think there's some evidence. There is evidence of that, but there again, I say investors are looking to many other factors besides the existence of a bid. But I think what it does do is it's one more signal, a positive signal, that investment is welcome. And certainly where you have a country, a developing country that has signed several bids, particularly with major capital exporting countries like the United States or Germany or the United Kingdom or France, I think there is strong evidence that in those situations that concerted program of treaty making leads to increased investment. The history had not been good. You know, South Africa had been subject to sanctions. South Africa, lots of people were expecting serious conflict to break out in South Africa. The ANC, the African National Congress, one of its principal allies in the struggle to be independent was the Communist Party. Not a great, that's not a great signal for foreign investors. So what South Africa did right after it became much more a democracy is it entered into a series of bilateral investment treaties, and in my judgment, the purpose was to reassure the capital markets that we are making international commitments to these major capital exporting countries as a way of increasing our reputation. What South Africa then felt more recently is that they felt these were constraining. Some of these treaties were constraining, particularly in their efforts to bring about increased black empowerment, to involve and give rights to domestic constituencies, particularly in the black community opportunities. And so they felt, that the current government felt that the existence of these international obligations was going to constrain their regulatory space. So what they did was they did not cancel the contracts because the treaties. Most of the treaties provide for an initial period in which it's to be in effect, usually 15 or 20 years. And once it gets to that end of that first period, either party is free to pull out, to say we're not going to renew it. And that's basically what South Africa said. But I think South Africa may have paid a price for that, because in my research, I saw that what happened this was in 2012. In 2012, when South Africa pulled out of these treaties or said it wasn't going to renew the treaties, it seemed, I don't know whether there was a cause and effect, but in the very next year, the credit rating of South Africa's sovereign debt dropped a notch. And what that means is if your credit rating for your sovereign bonds drops, you pay an increased rate of interest for your borrowing. Poland has declared it's going to. It has not yet done it. So that's the first issue. And I don't know whether this is a statement, how serious the statement is going to be. We'll have to wait and see. The European countries have before the European Union had made individual bids, not only with developing countries, but with each other, particularly Eastern Europe. So they'd signed a lot of them. So one of the problems, one of the challenges that that the European Union now has, is to how do we harmonize our international investment relationships, because foreign investment is under the new EU constitution is a subject of the unions, not of the individual states. So I think that has to be worked out. Under the ICSID Convention, which is a treaty, and now 140 different countries have signed it, both capital exporting, capital importing, developing countries, wealthy. They members of the treaty all make a commitment that they will enforce awards in their courts to the same extent they would have enforce an award, a judgment of their own higher courts. Because ICSID is a separate institution but is part of the World Bank Group, there is an argument you can make that a government that does not does not meet its obligations under ICSID awards may not be considered in good standing at the World Bank and the IMF, and therefore is not eligible or may not be eligible for loans. So that you have some leverage, there is some leverage. Well, there again, you have to find the assets.
Right.
And if you can find the assets, and again, it costs governments a lot to move their assets around to try to hide them. If even under the New York Convention, you can get enforcement, and if that's, for example, in the federal courts in the United States, and if the offending state or the offending private defendant has assets in this country, they can be seized and used to pay off a portion or all of the award. Now, there are certain immunities. I mean, you can't seize the embassy of a sovereign state, but in most countries there is a distinction between those assets used for sovereign purposes and those assets owned by the state that are not used for sovereign purposes, or not. And it's only the first group that has benefits from sovereign immunity. So if there is a bank account that's owned by a state corporation, let's say there's a state manufacturing corporation or the state airline, and that's available, those funds may be available to satisfy the award. Well, this is a big issue. I think there are lots of reforms that we can make. We can make, and that's what's going on now. We've just had signed the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, among 12 countries. The United States is one of them. Japan is another one. This is a major agreement. It deals with trade, but it's also deals with investment. There's a separate investment chapter. I think it's chapter 9, and if you read it, it looks just like a bilateral investment treaty. But it provides for investor-state arbitration. And I think the United States, I think, the government is quite insistent that its investment treaty should include investor-state arbitration. Because what's the option? What's the option? Pure promise with no enforcement mechanism is not going to be satisfactory. And now, it's said, for example, well, the U.S. courts are good, why can't we just use the U.S. courts are good? Well, as a friend of mine said, yes, the U.S. courts are good if you're an American. Foreign investors, for all they esteem the United States government and our system, nonetheless worry about the fact that they will not be treated fairly and impartially, and that they will suffer prejudice because they are foreigners. So I think we have to find some neutral ground. That's why arbitration was created, to find neutral ground to settle disputes. So I think they're going to continue. It will continue to be there, and whatever we design has got to have the element of neutrality and independence to assure the investors they will be treated fairly, and also the state, that the state will be, if the state is a defendant, the state will be treated fairly.